like to invite Bill Fulford. He is the founding director of the Collaborating Centre, but many of you will know him from all his huge bibliography of writings and publishings. So Bill, maybe I can invite you to give your commentary first. You're still muted, Bill.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Can you all hear me now? And for your kind introduction. It's an honor to be commenting on Guilherme's excellent book. And I'd like to draw out, Guilherme, you've given us a wonderful introduction to the book. I'd like to draw out one or two more of the themes that you've touched on by way of what I personally found particularly exciting and interesting in the book. And then I'd like to invite you to tell us a bit more about the values side of the work, which you touched on towards the end of your presentation. The book itself, it is of course original in topic, as you've rightly pointed out. Substance misuse is an area of psychiatry that has been relatively neglected, even by classical phenomenologists. And it remains a bit of a Cinderella subject, I think, even for contemporary practice. The big topics are, of course, the psychoses, schizophrenia, depression, and these are major pathologies. But in terms of the impact on our lives, substance misuse in different forms around the world must be at least as significant, and yet attracts relatively little interest. So the first important strength of the book is that here is a wonderful focus on a neglected area, substance misuse. I think a second strength of the book for me, and I think I've already said this in a commendation of the book, is that you are among those few phenomenologists who can make sense of the subject to non-phenomenologists. I mean, I have a background in philosophy as well as in psychiatry, but my background is very much in analytic philosophy of the Oxford tradition. And Guilherme, reading your work has helped me to gain an insight into phenomenology that I think I really couldn't have got through any other route. I will tell you a story against my own tradition. When I did my PhD many years ago, it was with, at the time, a famous Oxford philosopher, Mary Warnock. And Mary Warnock, when I was her pupil, was writing a book on Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. And when I'd finished and submitted my thesis, I asked Mary Warnock if I could read her book, because I thought my examiners might ask me about existentialism and I didn't know anything about it. And she said to me with her very wry English humor, Bill, you're welcome to read my book, but I undertook the writing of it in order to teach myself something about existentialism. I don't think I understand existentialism any better now than I did when I started writing the book. So we do struggle as non-phenomenologists. Of course, Mary Warnock was being too diffident. Her book has become a bit of a classic in the English-speaking world, and she understood existentialism extremely well. But nonetheless, we do all, I think, in my tradition of the Anglo-American analytic philosophical tradition, struggle with phenomenology. And you're one of the writers who can really give us an insight into that. And when we read your book, we feel as analytic philosophers, we can engage with it very, very closely. But it's of course more than that. And there are others who are going to be commenting who can say more about this than me. It is a distinctive take on or version of phenomenology. You mentioned this, Guilherme, in your presentation, that you're interested in dialectical phenomenology. And I will come back to that when we think about the links with values and values-based practice. So it's important in its originality, it's important in its clarity of presentation and its accessibility to non-phenomenologists, and it's important in providing a general theory of phenomenology. And my own view is that your dialectics, and I know there are others who've worked in a similar way. Dialectical phenomenology does have tremendous potential in linking up with some important developments in current clinical practice. And it's the whole area of clinical practice that I think is a second important area of strength. Again, Guilherme, you mentioned that this is a basis for person-centered care. Now, that phrase, person-centered care, is certainly a big buzzword in the UK. I think it is in the United States and perhaps in many other parts of the world. Often it means very little. You've given it a particular and distinctive expression in the way that you bring your phenomenological expertise to bear on drawing out the life world of the individual. And the key phrase there is the individual. What your framework and what the framework of other phenomenologists has helped us to come back to is understanding not just a general psychopathological state, but the particular life world, the particular set of experiences of the individual. This is crucial to understanding the individual for their unique challenges, but also strengths, and hence coming to a way of helping them as an individual. It's of course also important to destigmatize the field, and where your work helps us, I think, is not just in helping the individual, but also helping family and the community at large. And of course, you've worked a lot in policy as well as in clinical practice. So an approach to understanding substance misuse that destigmatizes the subject and helps the individual towards a person-centered form of clinical care. If I could mention a third strength for me, is the way in which your approach provides a basis for phenomenology to be a partner to the sciences. In your presentation, you described how you got into this subject by being dissatisfied with the psychopathology of the late 20th century. And I think many of us, including those working in the neurosciences at the time, were dissatisfied with the way that psychopathology had developed. It had become a very thinned down, a very etiolated version of the rich psychopathology that was available in the first half of the 20th century. This is no basis for the modern development of the neurosciences. What phenomenology is bringing us back to is a rich understanding and explication of the subjective aspects of our life world that is the crucial variable when we're coming to think about how the brain works and how the neurosciences can be applied clinically. The need for that is very clear in the extraordinary failure of translation of neuroscientific findings into clinically relevant and clinically helpful developments. Other areas of science, Ashok, your own field of vascular surgery, I know has right from the start, which I think vascular surgery is a younger field even than psychiatry, but I know that from what you've told me that right from the start, vascular surgery has been highly geared towards evidence-based practice. And that's because the wonderful scientific work that you and your colleagues have been doing has been readily translated into clinical care. We've moved very effectively from the laboratory to the bedside. Psychiatry has quite uniquely failed to make that same move. And in my view, this is not because of any inadequacy in its scientific base. It's an inadequacy in its understanding of the life world of the individuals with which it's concerned. It's the subjective, not the objective side of translation that we are failing on here. And Guilherme, your wonderful book, I think, could make an important contribution, both in its own field of substance misuse and as a model for other fields in helping us to enrich the subjective understanding of mental distress and disorder in a way which would allow us to link up the remarkable developments in the neurosciences more effectively with improvements in clinical care. So there are three key areas that I believe your book is contributing enormously to our field. What I would perhaps invite you to say a bit more about is how this would link up with your more recent work in values and values-based practice. And again, you've anticipated this a little bit in your introductory remarks. You mentioned that your particular area of expertise is, and particular way of developing phenomenology is in dialectical phenomenology. And this is a field that gives us a wonderful starting point for thinking about the value structure of the life world of the individual. And just to complicate that story slightly, we're thinking here of values not in a narrow sense, and certainly not just as limited to ethical values, but values understood as anything that matters or is important to the individual concerned. As I've understood dialectical phenomenology from your book and from talking with you, dialectical phenomenology is very much framed in terms of a balance of or tension between different aspects of a person's life world. And many of those tensions and balances are tensions between things that matter or are important. We have conflicting things that are important to us. This must above all be true with substance misuse, and it gives us a very important framework within which to start thinking about the values of the individual, how they relate to the values of family, friends, the wider society, and how those values can come together in a person-centered approach to clinical care. I'm sure with most people in the room, I don't need to emphasize that concept of person-centered care, and particularly the valuational aspects of it, are crucial in mental health to the whole concept of recovery. And recovery is a term that perhaps for the non-mental health people in the room, it's worth just mentioning. That doesn't mean getting rid of symptoms. It may mean getting rid of symptoms, but what it really means is recovering a good quality of life as defined by the values of the individual concerned. I'm sure you can see how directly Guilherme's work on dialectical phenomenology and the existential structure of the life world, not just of people with substance misuse, but many other areas, sure you can see how that dialectical model feeds directly into what we need to understand about the individual to support their journey towards recovery. And finally, there is a wider connection here with another aspect of contemporary clinical practice that is closely related to person-centered care and recovery, and that is about shared clinical decision-making. And shared clinical decision-making is moving rapidly up the agenda in many parts of the world. In the UK, we had a Supreme Court decision in 2015 that made shared decision-making the basis of consent to treatment. So it's not just in psychiatry, but across the whole of health and social care. This is called the Montgomery judgment. The Montgomery judgment said that consent to treatment depends on a dialogue, not just one person talking, but a dialogue between clinician and patient that brings together the clinician's expert understanding with what's important or matters to, with the values of the individual concerned. Now, I think it's no coincidence that the word dialogue and the word dialectics have similar roots. They are both talking about a tension, a dialogue, two-way process. And you can see, I think, immediately in that connection that your dialectical phenomenology could be crucial to how we understand and develop the concept of shared decision-making, particularly in the context of mental health. And to me, Guilherme, this is a point of development of your work that I feel could make for very exciting horizons for us, not just in the UK or in Brazil, but around the world generally, in the way that psychiatry is developing as an internationally enriched field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I think the first words go to Guilherme. So comments from the author, and then I'll see if there are any other comments in the chat.
Thank you very much, Bill, for your words, for your reading of the book, and as well as for your comprehensive context of you offered of the book in contemporary psychiatry and mental health. To give an accurate understanding of the role of phenomenology as a philosophical movement from the very beginning, in the beginning of the 20th century, I should say that in the cradle of the movement of phenomenology, there was a specific attention to the concept of value, which in the very heart of the phenomenological movement was somewhat neglected afterwards. Just to mention, we could say that there's one of the founding fathers of phenomenological movement, German philosopher Max Scheler, had a very important account of values in phenomenology. So we could even say that it's funny, well, this should be addressed by historians, why this point of phenomenological, this core aspect of phenomenological experiences, which are values, were not exactly addressed by phenomenological psychopathology in its classical times. So, bridging this contemporary gap between values as a perspective, as a wide perspective in approaching mental disorders or whatever disorder, and phenomenology is more of resuming or recalling this rich tradition of phenomenology. So we should say that a values-based perspective is a phenomenological perspective, and reversely, a phenomenological perspective is a values-based perspective. This brings us to the topic of another classical topic in Western philosophy. This one of dialectics came to the fore. So why dialectical phenomenology? Dialectical phenomenology is by no means a creation of mine. It's rather a recalling of another tradition of dialectics within phenomenology, which has been created, so to speak, in the 60s, in the 1960s. And why this? Because with this dialectical perspective, we, as phenomenologists, as psychopathologists, as philosophers, can shed light on the very nature of human experiences, which are its ambiguity, its duplicity sometimes, or its capacity of being the same and another thing at the same time. This may sound a little bit too philosophical when said this way, in this short way, but for clinicians, even clinicians not at all related to phenomenology, this is a very current perspective. These are the characteristics of daily clinical activity. I mean by that every time someone, a person, say a patient, has a problem, this experience of having a disturbed experience has simultaneous double or even more perspectives, both this impaired experience, some part of which we call altered perspective, some loss of something, but at the same time, an open possibility for creating something. So it is from the very nature of human being that every experience means an ambiguity. And the clinical psychiatry and clinical all people related to clinical care knows that. It knows that beforehand, knows that without knowing phenomenology. This is, Bill, why the most important challenge in phenomenology is actually tries to depict it, the real structure of experiences. So it's the opposite of being complex, so to speak. We could say that searching for simplicity is the hallmark of phenomenological tradition, though for this search, sometimes phenomenology had to create some words because assessing simplicity, assessing the real experienced world is sometimes very difficult. Reality is not exactly easy to access. So that's why the idea of bringing dialectical phenomenology to values-based perspective into this field of substance misuse is, after all, a way of raising awareness, both for the people who experience substance misuse and for the people who are engaged in helping these people to convey the real experiences of these persons. That means trying to give words, and this is maybe the most important thing. Our aim, our endeavor is to give words for people engaged in mental health to convey their actual experience, the experiences they've been actually living in everyday life. And I mean, and I hope that with resuming these old categories of phenomenological psychopathology, we can, if not reach this goal, but at least bridge this gap between the experiences and the categories to access them.
I'd like to thank you, Guilherme, for that. And I think that you've made my point that this is a book that in its own right is wonderfully illuminating, and I'm sure is going to lead on to many further illuminations. You used a key phrase there about raising awareness. And if that's what phenomenology does, it's a direct counterpart of the core of what the clinical skills training of values-based practice is about. They're both about raising awareness. They're also, I think, alike in aiming for simplicity, but recognizing that you have to find that through great complexity, and reducing the complexity to checklists and rather meaningless measures is a guaranteed way of losing the reality of a person's experience. I'm conscious that there are questions in the chat, Ashok, so I'm going to shut up there.
Thanks, Bill. Guilherme, if we could take one question first, and then I know that we've got Rebecca also going to talk about the translation. So one question I'd like to pick up is from Wellington, who says, what are the challenges you encountered when researching a field that is so controversial and heavy with prejudice, such as substance misuse?
Okay, thank you, Wellington. This is a very interesting question. Not easy to respond to, but I'll try to do so in the very spirit I've put it forward in the last remarks. I think, as a medical doctor, as a clinician, that the most challenging point in dealing with this problem is exactly try to make it this experience in a comprehensible way, to translate this experience to make it neither the result of free will decision, nor the result of a brain disturbed physiological system. That is, for good or for bad reasons, contemporary, we have these two interpretations, two mainstream interpretations. Either you have the free will to be a substance misuser, so you should be blamed for that. On the other hand, you have this addiction brain disease model, that is, you have a disease, a brain disease, as say a brain stroke. My challenge has been trying to show to society and to my patients and to the families that something and this is the challenge of this book, the third part of this book, that addiction, mostly addiction, is neither nor phenomenon, neither a free will phenomenon nor a phenomenon determined from outside, determined from the brain. It is somewhat an existential state, and as such, it requires specific clinical measures, specific clinical procedures that have not so far been so developed, and the whole mental health field, as far as I understand. So the undevelopment of psychopathological understanding of substance misuse has as outcome the undevelopment of insufficient development of care, of policies as well. And this is the challenge for a psychopathologist, if I may so